in life. Suddenly we're involved in life. We're doing everything that the Lord has called us to do. We're happy. We're enjoying everything all around us. And suddenly, when you least expect it, it seems like you fall into a hole. You fall into a pit. And suddenly your growth, your progress just comes to a screeching halt. You had so many aspirations, you had so many dreams, you had so many goals, so many objectives, so many things that you wanted to accomplish, and suddenly in just one split of a second, everything that you had planned suddenly becomes to a halt. I don't know if anybody knows what I'm talking about tonight. But there are times in life when we find ourselves in an impossible situation. It feels like our excitement, our energy, our enthusiasm, the desire that we had to seek and reach the promises of God, it feels like they have dried out. You no longer have the strength that you used to have before. You no longer have the energy you used to have before. Before you could jump and shout and you could lift up your hands and you had a good old Holy Ghost time within the service. But suddenly, in the midst of sudden circumstances, you find yourself in one of life's pits. And when you find yourself in that situation, what it does is that it brings anxiety and desperation. And when somebody is desperate, you will do whatever it takes just so that you can change the situation. Because you no longer want to be in that present state. You want that to be changed. And when you are desperate, you'll do whatever it takes. You'll even do what you never thought would be possible. You'll do it just to try to change that situation. See, tonight I want to talk to you a little bit about desperate situations. See, because desperation in our lives has a tendency, it could either be good or it could be bad. See, because sometimes desperation has a tendency of guiding us down the wrong path. See, when you're desperate, you'll do whatever it takes, even though you may know it's not the right thing. Just to try to survive. Just to try to make it. You know that they've told you and they've talked about it and they've said it's not possible, you should not do it. But since you're desperate, you'll do whatever it takes and you're willing to suffer the consequences just so that you can change that present state. See, that's why I want to talk to you about desperation. Because it can guide you down the wrong path. Desperation can be a dangerous thing. Touch your neighbor and tell them desperation can be a dangerous thing. See, when we look into the Bible, it was desperation that drove Naomi and her family to flee from Bethlehem in the midst of a famine and go and live in the midst of their enemies in the city of Moab. It was desperation. It was desperation that caused the prodigal son to go and mishandle all his inheritance and spend everything he had and then find themselves eating the food that was meant for the swine. It was desperation. Desperation is what drove Peter to deny Christ on 3 occasions. It was desperation. Desperation is what drove Judas to hang himself after the betrayal of Jesus. It was desperation. See, when we find ourselves in desperate times, our desperation can take us along the wrong path. But if we learn how to manage our desperate times, then our results will be totally different. See, because desperation is what drove the woman of the issue of blood to go and touch the hem of Jesus' garments. It was desperation. Touch your neighbor and tell him it was desperation. See, it was desperation that caused the blind man Bartimaeus to shout and say, "Son of David, have mercy on me." It was desperation. It was desperation that caused the woman of the alabaster flask to go in and before the feet of Jesus and pour out her heart before Jesus. And in the midst of that outpouring, her soul was able to be restored. See, it was desperation that drove Jairus, a ruler of the synagogue, to put his pride aside and call out and run out to Jesus and plead to Jesus and say, Jesus, please come to my house because my daughter is dying and I need you to pray for her. It was desperation. See, we need to know how to manage our desperate times. Especially in these days we are living in some difficult times. Some economic troubles. Difficulties in our homes, difficulties in our schools, difficulties in our streets. These are desperate times. But we must be careful because desperation can be a dangerous thing. We know all that there's a saying that says that desperate times calls for desperate measures. Desperation. But today we must ask ourselves the following: how are we handling our desperate times? Are we being driven away from Christ? Or are we moving towards the feet of Jesus? Today we will be learning on how to handle the desperations of life. The prophet Elijah is a prime example of a person who found themselves running into many desperate situations. He was a prophet of God. As many call him the prophet of fire. He saw great and wonderful miracles. But yet he found themselves in many desperate situations. As we look in this passage of the prophet Elisha, we begin to see what began to take place. The Syrians became bothered by Elisha. See, because they had their plans of how to defeat the children of Israel. They would prepare their strategies. And they would say, we're going to go to such place and we're going to wait for them and we're going to ambush them. And suddenly the Lord would reveal it to Elisha. And Elisha would go and tell it to the king. And they would change the way of the direction they were going. And the Syrian king did not know what was going on. Syrian king was all messed up. Syrian king would say, is there a mole among us? Who is telling the Israelites our secrets? Who is it? Because he will die. So one of his men came up to him and said, sorry, king, but it's none of our men. It's that within the children of Israel, there's a prophet. That the Lord reveals everything to him. And when he receives that revelation, he gives the news to the king. The Syrian king said, well, this has to stop. Find me this prophet. Find me this man. And bring him to me. They began to call for him. He sent his soldiers. They found out that he was in the city of Dothan. And the soldiers went after to try to get Elisha. Yes, see, it's interesting because the town of Dothan is not a town that is talked about much in the Bible. I try to find different references about the town of Dothan and you don't find anything. I only came across one other occasion in the Bible where the city is mentioned. See, it was mentioned in the book of Genesis. During the story of Joseph, when his father had told Joseph to go and find his brothers, he was looking for them. And they told him they're in the town of Dothan. So he went. And the Bible tells us that as Joseph was coming closer to the city, it was there that his brothers began to conspire against him. As they saw him from far, they began to talk amongst each other. And they said, this is our opportunity to kill Joseph. They were conspiring to kill their brother. They were jealous of him. They were bothered of him. He was the favorite of their father. And they said, this is our opportunity. They began to conspire against Joseph. I call it the conspiracy theory.